Two boys in Linz, the beginning of an unusual friendship. The young Hitler I knew, the memoirs of Hitler's childhood friend. There are moments in life that only reveal their true significance many years later, when time has softened some memories and sharpened others. When I look back now, I can say with certainty that my friendship with Adolf Hitler began not with a dramatic encounter, but with something far more ordinary, two boys in a small, provincial city discovering that the world inside their minds was far larger than the world around them. Linz, the city of my youth, rested quietly along the Danube, wrapped in a rhythm of daily life that never changed very much. People lived simply. Days passed gently, almost predictably. And yet, just beneath that calm surface, destinies were being shaped, destinies none of us could have imagined at the time. I was just Ludwig, the son of an upholsterer, carrying my violin case through its narrow streets. I had dreams, yes, but they were modest ones. To play, to study, to lose myself in music. Nothing in my appearance or my habits suggested that I would one day become the closest companion to a boy whose path would lead him toward darkness on a scale the world had never seen. But life has a way of weaving threads together long before we understand the pattern they form. And that is how our story begins. I first noticed Adolf at the opera. It was an evening performance of Wagner, as it often was in those days, for Wagner's works possessed Adolf in a way no other music could. Even before we spoke, I found myself drawn to him for reasons I could not explain. He sat several rows ahead of me, rigid, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the stage with an intensity that set him apart from everyone else. Other boys fidgeted. They whispered or drifted. But Adolf, he seemed to be swallowed entirely by the music. His hands did not twitch. His posture did not relax. He absorbed every note as if the performance were being given for him alone. I was struck by that seriousness. Such concentration in a boy of his age was unusual. He couldn't have been more than 16, yet he behaved like someone twice his age. There was something fierce, almost consuming, in the way he listened. When the opera ended, most of the audience filed out into the night with the easy chatter of people content to return to their ordinary lives. But Adolf lingered. He stood near the entrance, his expression thoughtful, almost brooding. And then he approached me. "You know," he said without introduction, "Wagner must be experienced, not discussed." It wasn't the greeting I expected, nor was it delivered gently. He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed he was stating a universal truth. That was the moment our friendship began. Abrupt, intense, and entirely in his style. The days that followed brought us together naturally. I learned quickly that Adolf was not a boy who wandered through life aimlessly. Instead, he seemed driven by invisible forces, ambitions, frustrations, visions that he rarely expressed fully, but often hinted at in long, winding monologues. We walked together after school, usually along the river or across the tree-lined promenades of Linz. Many boys our age talked about games, about girls, about mischief. Adolf, however, spoke about cathedrals, city plans, great heroes of history, and the destiny he felt awaited him. He had an almost feverish admiration for architecture. It was not enough for him to describe a building. He wanted to redesign it, reinterpret it, reshape it according to the grand vision he carried within his mind. He would stop in the middle of a street, gesturing at a simple structure, explaining how the roof line should change, how the windows should be positioned, how the entire neighborhood could be transformed into something monumental. Once, he halted in front of a modest apartment house and declared, "This could have been magnificent. But look how they've ruined the proportions. It's as if no one understands beauty anymore." His voice sharpened as he spoke, and he turned to me with such passion that I felt compelled to agree, even when the building seemed perfectly ordinary to me. If Adolf had been merely opinionated, our friendship might have faded quickly. But there was something else about him, something compelling. He possessed a sensitivity that bordered on vulnerability. Small slights wounded him deeply. He often withdrew into long silences when something upset him. There were days when he appeared cheerful and full of energy, outlining plans for great works he intended to create one day. And then, without warning, he would sink into a dark mood, speaking of the world's injustices, of people who misunderstood him, of the limitations of the life into which he'd been born. It was not easy to keep pace with him, but I felt drawn to him, perhaps because he needed someone who would listen, someone who could steady him when his emotions swayed too wildly. And so I became that person. Opera became the heart of our friendship. We attended performances as often as we could afford, which was rarely, given our financial circumstances. But when we did manage to go, those nights became almost sacred to us. To Adolf, Wagner was not merely a composer. He was a prophet, a force of nature, a visionary who saw the world in grand, mythic terms. During the performance, Adolf sat as if carved from stone. But once the curtains closed, something extraordinary happened. The music seemed to ignite him from within. We would walk through the quiet streets late into the night, sometimes until dawn. Adolf would speak continuously of heroes, of fate, of battles, of redemption. He connected the stories of Wagner's operas to the struggles of nations or the destinies of individuals. His voice would rise, his gestures would grow dramatic. At times, he became so overwhelmed that he would stop in his tracks and stare into the distance, as if he could see a future no one else could imagine. I listened, often mesmerized. There was something powerful in the way he believed, in music, in beauty, in destiny. Even when I found his ideas excessive, I could not deny his intensity. As our friendship deepened, one theme began to dominate Adolf's thoughts: Vienna. To him, Vienna was not merely the capital of the empire. It was the center of culture, the heart of art, the place where geniuses were recognized and celebrated. Every time we attended a performance or discussed architecture, the conversation eventually circled back to the same conclusion. Vienna is where I must go. He spoke the words with such conviction that I believed him entirely. But it wasn't simply ambition that drew him there. He felt trapped in Linz, constrained by its routines, misunderstood by its people, and stifled by the modest expectations placed upon him. In Vienna, he imagined freedom, a chance to prove himself, to create, to become the person he believed he was destined to be. The longer we spent together, the clearer it became. Every conversation, every sketch he drew, every dream he revealed pointed in the same direction. Vienna was calling him. Adolf rarely spoke of his father with affection. He described him as strict, unyielding, often dismissive of his dreams. His mother, however, he adored. She was the one person who understood him, or at least, the one person he believed understood him. But even she could not sway his determination to leave for Vienna. Linz offers me nothing, he told me one evening with a mixture of sadness and defiance. Vienna is where my real life begins. I sensed the tension at home, though he rarely admitted it directly. He struggled with the expectations placed upon him. He refused to follow the practical path laid before him: secure work, a stable trade, a predictable future. Adolf wanted more, much more. And the more he dreamed, the more restless he became. As Adolf grew more consumed by his plans, I noticed a change in him. His moods became sharper, swings more pronounced. He grew less patient with others, less tolerant of opinions that contradicted his own. And yet, with me, he remained open, almost vulnerable. He shared his fears, his frustrations, his bitterness about school, his belief that he was meant for something greater. I sometimes wondered why he confided so much in me. Perhaps it was because I listened without mockery. Perhaps because I treated him not as an oddity, but as a person with a unique mind. Or perhaps because, beneath all his intensity, he was simply lonely. Whatever the reason, Our friendship deepened during this time, even as the world around us remained unaware of the storms brewing inside him. There is one night I remember more clearly than all the others. We had just left a performance of Rienzi, one of Adolf's favorites. He was unusually quiet at first, walking beside me in silence as the echoes of the opera lingered in the cool night air. Then suddenly he stopped. His face was pale, but his eyes blazed with a fierce light. "Do you understand?" he said slowly. "What it means to be chosen by fate. Rienzi rises from nothing. He becomes the voice of the people. He becomes the destiny of his nation." He paused, breathing heavily. "That," he whispered, "is what I feel inside me." I didn't know how to respond. How could I? We were boys, just boys. Yet in that moment, Adolf spoke with the certainty of a man who believed he had glimpsed his own future. I felt a shiver run through me, though I could not have explained why. As winter settled over Linz, Adolf grew increasingly impatient. He spent long hours drawing architectural designs, planning for the Academy of Fine Arts, imagining the life that awaited him in Vienna. He talked endlessly of the museums he would visit, the operas he would attend, the historic sites he would walk through. Every step he took seemed to carry him closer to that dream. Our walks during those days were filled with a different kind of energy. A sense of farewell lingered beneath every conversation. We both knew he would soon leave, though neither of us said it aloud. And then, one cold morning, he announced it plainly. "I am going to Vienna." The decision felt final, inevitable. I remember standing beside him as he prepared his few belongings. He was unusually calm, almost solemn. The boy I had met months earlier, a dreamer, restless and unsteady, had transformed into someone who believed completely in the path ahead. As he boarded the train, he turned to me with a look that mixed hope and defiance. "When I return," he said, "everything will be different." And with that, he disappeared into the world that would shape him, test him, and ultimately transform him. Our friendship had begun in the quiet streets of Linz, but the next chapter would unfold in Vienna city far grander, far harsher, and far more decisive than either of us could have imagined at the time. When Adolf boarded that train for Vienna, I believed, perhaps naively, that he was embarking on an adventure shaped by talent and ambition. He was a boy overflowing with dreams, carrying little more than a portfolio of sketches and the certainty that greatness awaited him in the capital. But Vienna was not the city he imagined. In time, I learned that the journey he took was not a rising path, but a descent slow, painful, devastating. And the Vienna we both loved from afar soon revealed a different face. A city that could elevate young artists to brilliance or crush them without hesitation. This is the story of how Vienna transformed Adolf Hitler, not into the figure history would come to fear, but into a young man battered by disappointment, tested by poverty, forced to confront the gap between dream and reality. When Adolf first arrived, his letters were filled with excitement. He described Vienna with breathless admiration. The sweeping boulevards, the grand museums, the gilded facades of the Ringstrasse, the opera houses towering like temples dedicated to beauty. He insisted that every corner of the city felt alive with culture. He wrote of hours spent lingering outside art stores, studying plaster casts of classical sculptures, as though waiting to be invited into a world that already belonged to him in his imagination. But between the lines, I sensed something else. A tremor of uncertainty, a hint of intimidation. For the first time, Adolf was surrounded by people who shared his passions, his ambitions, his obsessions with art and architecture. In Linz, he had felt like a genius misunderstood. In Vienna, he was simply one among thousands. This realization unsettled him more than he admitted. Adolf's first goal in Vienna was clear: to gain admission to the Academy of Fine Arts. He believed the examiners would be dazzled by his talent. that they would recognize the precision of his architectural drawings and overlook his weaknesses in figure sketching. He wrote to me confidently, "I feel certain they will take me. I belong here." But Vienna, for all its beauty, was not a city that opened its doors easily. When the exam date arrived, Adolf dressed in his best clothes, simple, clean, carefully prepared by his mother months earlier. He carried his portfolio with almost ceremonial reverence. I later learned what happened inside the academy. The examiners reviewed his work. They praised his architectural lines sharp, controlled, imaginative. But they criticized his human figures, calling them stiff, lifeless, lacking the energy expected of a painter. When the rejection came, Adolf was devastated, but he did not describe it that way in his letters. He blamed the academy. He blamed the instructors. He blamed the process. He insisted he had been misunderstood. "It was not my talent that failed," he wrote, "but their inability to see what I can become." Even then, he shielded his pride with a sense of injustice. After the rejection, Adolf did not return to Linz as many expected. Instead, he chose to remain in Vienna, convinced he could still find a way forward. But Vienna was expensive, and money was scarce. His small inheritance, left from his father, dwindled quickly. He moved from one cheap lodging house to another, each more uncomfortable than the last. His days lacked structure. He wandered through museums for hours. He sat in cafes, nursing a single cup of coffee. He watched people in parks, commenting on their manners, their dress, their apparent lack of taste. He spent long afternoons sketching buildings he admired, yet he did not share many of those drawings with me. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he feared criticism. More likely, he was struggling with doubt that he rarely acknowledged aloud. The boy who once brimmed with certainty now felt the weight of failure, though he would never admit it openly. Despite his first rejection, Adolf planned to apply again the following year. He worked tirelessly on improving his portfolio. At least, that's what he claimed. But his letters revealed long stretches where he produced nothing at all. His energy was inconsistent. Some days he was consumed by determination. Others he fell into dark moods that left him paralyzed. When the second exam approached, Adolf seemed anxious, desperate even, but he maintained a mask of confidence. "That place belongs to me," he insisted. "They simply failed to understand my potential last time." But the second rejection was far more final. The academy not only refused to admit him, they advised him to consider a different career altogether. Architecture, perhaps, but not painting. This blow shook him deeply. For the first time, he admitted to me that he felt lost. "I do not know what to do," he wrote. "It is as though a door has closed, and I am left outside with no way in." It was a rare moment of vulnerability. But soon that vulnerability hardened into resentment. Vienna was not kind to the poor. As Adolf's funds ran out, he began selling his few possessions. A warm coat, some books, sketching materials, even sentimental items from his family. Eventually, he found himself in lodging houses for men of limited means, crowded, cold, and often unsafe. His letters became fewer. When he did write, the tone was strained, hurried, as though he did not want me to glimpse the full extent of his hardship. One letter simply read, "I am managing. Do not worry." But years later, when he spoke about this period, he described it as the lowest point of his life. He skipped meals. He slept in rooms crawling with vermin. He grew thin, pale, and increasingly bitter. Vienna, the city he had once worshipped, was slowly crushing him. The moment he opened the door of his small room, I realized the situation was far worse than he had described. The air inside was cold and damp. His bed was nothing more than a thin mattress atop wooden boards. His belongings were scattered, mostly old papers, unfinished drawings, worn-out clothes. Yet Adolf greeted me with forced enthusiasm. "I am simply going through a phase," he said. "It will pass." But I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. I could hear the hunger in his voice. He was no longer the energetic dreamer who had paced the streets of Linz, describing magnificent cities and daring architectural visions. He seemed defeated, but he also seemed angry. Anger became the force that kept him moving. Something fundamental changed in Adolf during his years of hardship. His bitterness grew sharper. He complained increasingly about groups of people he believed were responsible for Vienna's social and artistic decline. His judgments became more absolute, more categorical. He developed strong opinions about politics, society, and culture, opinions he had never expressed with such intensity in Linz. Some of these ideas were troubling even then. They reflected frustration, wounded pride, and a growing tendency to blame instead of reflect. He began to see the world in stark contrasts. Genius versus mediocrity, purity versus corruption, greatness versus decay. There was little room for nuance. To survive, Adolf began painting small watercolors, scenes of Vienna's landmarks, which he sold to tourists and small shops. It was humble work, far from what he imagined for himself, but it kept him alive. Sometimes he earned enough for a decent meal. Other times he barely earned a few coins. Yet he continued, driven not by passion, but by necessity. His life became a cycle of struggle, painting cheap views of the city, selling them for whatever he could get, walking endlessly to stay warm, skipping meals to save money, sleeping in shelters when he could not afford a room. These experiences hardened him. They also isolated him further. Even years later, Adolf spoke of his mother with deep sorrow. Her death had left an emptiness inside him, and Vienna only magnified that loneliness. He had lost the one person who offered him unconditional love. Now he faced the world alone, with no support, no guidance, no sense of belonging. When he spoke of her, his voice softened in a way I rarely heard otherwise. He carried her memory like a fragile treasure. But grief also fueled his inner turmoil. It made him more susceptible to despair, more vulnerable to resentment. Vienna did not heal him, it deepened the wounds. There were months when Adolf nearly disappeared from my life. His letters stopped. No one in our neighborhood heard from him. Rumors reached me that he had fallen gravely ill, or that he had been forced into the poorest shelters. Years later, he confirmed that he had reached a breaking point. He described days spent lying in bed, too weak to rise, too hopeless to work. He felt abandoned by destiny, betrayed by the world. And yet, slowly, he began to rebuild himself. He continued painting. He sought out work where he could. He developed new routines, rigid, demanding routines that gave him a sense of control. It was during this rebuilding phase that his worldview solidified. His ideas grew sharper, more extreme, more unyielding. He believed he had suffered because the world was unjust, and that it was his purpose to challenge that injustice one day. Vienna had broken him, but it had also forged him. By 1909, Adolf was no longer the boy who left Linz with dreams of artistic glory. He had become someone harder, someone fiercer, someone burdened by anger and disappointment. And yet, I did not fully understand what had happened to him until much later, until World War I drew him into its chaos and transformed him even further. But before the war came another tragedy, one far more personal, far more devastating. A tragedy rooted not in poverty or rejection, but in the deepest human bond he had ever known.